Most of the time when these people be talking, I don't even hear them. They talk and they talk, but I do not hear shit when I'm near them. I swear to God that I can't.
If you're a native of Georgia, then you know that there is more to Georgia than beautiful scenery, farms, and southern hospitality. Georgia is home to some of the creepiest and haunted places in the United States, with events that span from war to a lover's quarrel. It's no surprise that I would make a top 10 video for the Empire State of the South. Up until the early 19th century, mental illness was still seen as a misunderstood disease, and anyone was clinically seen as mentally ill for almost anything. Those who were diagnosed or misdiagnosed were shunned by the community, treated horribly, thrown into prisons, locked away at home, or used as slaves for those who were not. It wasn't until 1834 that Georgia Governor Wilson Lumpkin fought for state care of what he called the idiots, lunatics, and insane. The Georgia House and Senate approved, and a lunacy commission was formed with some of its earliest members joining from Milledgeville, Georgia. These same doctors petitioned the state to open a state lunatic, idiot, and epileptic asylum on December 28, 1837. This would be the first of its kind, since most asylums at the time were 1 out of the 3 and not all. Some years later, the hospital was put in control by trustees, the superintendent being Dr. David Cooper. The doctors in Milledgeville were paid small salaries, and only their everyday expenses were covered. Because of this, their work was mainly seen as a public service more than a job. However, they could continue with their own private practices in Milledgeville. The first few buildings of the hospital were made of brick with wood roofs between 3 of the 4 floors each. Each floor had about 20 rooms with cast iron windows opening into the hallway. Lamps or torches will lead the nurses' ways as they walked down the airy hallway to the men's floors, which were the bottom 2, and back up to the women's floors. Slaves and servants lived in the basement, and 8 staff members managed the entire building. Being sent to the institution wasn't easy. There was a system to it that differed from media representation of being kidnapped in the middle of the night, although that did happen in other facilities. No, this institution was much more sophisticated. Before you could be sent to the institution, you had to stand trial, and if you were a danger to the community, a legal record would be made and you would be sent to the hospital in chains. If you were rowdy, you would be put in a blue room. If that wasn't enough, you'd be chained to a chair and placed in the corner until you became calm. Dr. Cooper adopted a belief of seeing the patients as extended family, believing that they were better in the care of an extended family member or friend than at home where they were misunderstood. He didn't keep them locked up or in their rooms, and they could work in the garden, field, or workshop to gain a sense of usefulness. His successor, in 1845, Dr. Thomas A. Green continued this model of treatment, making it a ritual to remove the newcomers' shackles when they arrived and treating any wounds they may have due to beatings. He would also go on to abolish physical restraints and refuse to turn away patients, even when the institution was becoming far too overcrowded. However, his loving nature would soon reap its consequences. With the Civil War raging on and the cotton economy of Georgia taking a major hit, many families could not afford to hospitalize their family members. Dr. Green petitioned for more money, however it was simply untenable. This launched the institution into the hands of the political machines. And by the time General Sherman had marched through Georgia, the institution was crumbling on its own. All the able-bodied that could help oversee the institution were all fighting in the war, and now the institution barely had any support for the defeated state. Dr. Green had to resort to selling off what little the institution had for cash and scouring the countryside for food and supplies. With the South's defeat and the freeing of the slaves, the institution became overloaded with black patients, so much so that some were forced to sleep outside on hospital grounds until the first color-only building was built in 1866. By 1872, 448 patients were being treated by doctors with ratios hitting 100 to 1, with an annual budget of $100,000. Dr. Green finally began to cut back on intake by only accepting nonviolent patients and putting patients in rooms of 2 to 3 in each. Those that had been at the facility for 1 year or more were deemed treated and could return home. However, despite his efforts, the explosion of patients was just beginning. In 1874, Dr. Theophilus Powell became superintendent of the facility and was immediately overtaken by the issue of overcrowding. Communities had begun to turn the institution into a dumping ground. The once sophisticated procedure of admitting patients was now mere myth, and the unwanted of the communities were being sent to the facility without pause. In 1877, the institution was made free to state residents, and it was bursting at the seams. Dr. Powell tried to make the population manageable by changing intake methods, and a law was soon passed to allow those that could not pose harm or those that were deemed untreatable to be released. However, it wasn't until the 20th century that the overcrowding of the institution became known. The institution was renamed the Georgia State Sanitarium, and by 1910, over 3,000 patients were cared for by 12 doctors. The sanitarium's level of care decreased tremendously, with only patients' basic needs being met. With an enormous workload and never-ending number of new patients, workers began to neglect and abuse patients. Many patients whose diagnoses were unclassified were said to have vanished from the bowels of the sanitarium, never to be heard from again. The Georgia State Sanitarium changed its name once again, this time changing it to the Milledgeville State Hospital. Some say the change was to show society's change in the way they viewed the clinically insane. Others believe it was to mask its dark future and disgusting inner workings. The hospital was now a city. It had a population of over 6,000 patients, 600 per physician, and a waiting list of 1,500. Acres were added to house more patients, and a dedicated tuberculosis ward was made. However, state funding was still low, and radical forms of treatment were made to combat the patient's residency lengths. Insulin shock and electroshock therapy became common. Electroshock was done in masses at the discretion of the staff. This meant that if you angered any one of the staff at any time, you could be endangering everyone to electroshock therapy. The therapy resulted in severe memory loss, and many believed that that was their way of erasing the patient's memory so that they couldn't remember the abuse. Lobotomies were introduced in critical cases. However, they weren't very successful. 125 severely ill patients were given the treatment, and only 24 returned home cured. Others had gotten worse. Atlanta newspapers ran frequent articles about the abuse, treatment, and deteriorating conditions of the hospital. By the 1960s, the hospital became one of the largest hospitals in the country. While some patients eventually returned home, many of them didn't, literally vanishing. Many of its rolling fields outside of the hospital are secret burial grounds with over 30,000 patients buried in 6 neglected cemeteries with only metal poles with numbers to mark their headstones. This makes it one of the largest graveyards for people with mental disabilities. Groundskeepers even toss thousands of these makeshift headstones into the woods, leaving many to speculate what the true number of bodies on the grounds are. With the 20th century rearing its head, improved forms of treatment, medication, and hospitalization became available. The need for the hospital died down, with numbers dwindling and the hospital eventually closing in 2010. Milledgeville State Hospital still stands today. Though the building is deteriorating, many believe it to be haunted. If you walk the halls, voices can be heard, objects move, people can be touched, and shadows dart past you. Some visitors have taken photos, and the number of unexplainable orbs seen are in huge numbers. Its history, the mistreatment of patients, and the ghostly findings make Milledgeville one of the creepiest places in Georgia.